Hello, thank you everyone for joining this track. My name is Damir, and I have the pleasure to share a bit about the machine learning work that's going on at Novartis. So my colleague Moritz and me, we are part of Applied Technology Innovation team, and we are going to talk a little about applying natural language processing to detect potential adverse events in social media. It's a product that we labeled AI Brain. So before going into any details, I just want to touch on the definition of adverse events. So basically by National Cancer Institute, it's an unexpected medical problem that happens during treatment with a drug or any other therapy. So it can be mild, moderate, or severe, and maybe also caused by something other than the drug or therapy being used. It's also called an adverse effect. And the way this has to be handled within probably most of the pharma companies. So any employee that encounters such an event needs to report about that within 24 hours. And the channels that this can come from are either doctor's notes, emails, calls. In this case, we are going to touch on the social media as a source. So as a source, this is a very challenging and actually costly to monitor input channel. Because of the very high volume of data, because of complex and improper language use, and in general, just human creativity online. All the hashtags, all the acronyms, slangs, emojis, and so on. And in our case, we have, I would say, several hundreds of accounts which receive the data and probably hundreds of thousands of posts over a year. So it's quite challenging. Until now, this process has been highly manual, expensive, as you can imagine, and time-consuming. So the idea of this was to move into a solution which would reduce the necessary manual review workload with using NLP. And the key here is that we are not relying purely on the machine, but we want to keep the human in the loop. So it's really, not leaving all the responsibility on the machine, but we have safety experts who need to action. Now pulling out a bit of the higher view, so not only focus on the machine learning, but actually the whole data science problem here. So there are three main challenges. First of all is the data itself, so the unstructured language and social media as a source. Second one is the domain, so the medical domain knowledge and the safety knowledge, and the business expectations in the end. So regarding the language and social media, we need to perform on a very broad problem domain. We need to handle this specific styled social media text and very low frequency of actual events. So we are talking 1 in 1,000 or even less. Regarding medical domain knowledge, so we kind of need to mimic the medical practitioners' understanding of the adverse events and also be able to reason about causes and effects. So one example here is, let's say the post says, "Why did I get a headache when I was using iMovig?" At first you could see, okay, there's a condition, there's a drug, so this is an adverse event. But actually, if you knew about the domain, that you would say, actually, Imovig is treating a migraine or preventing migraine. So in this case, this would not be an adverse event by an expert judgment. However, machine would say, yeah, there's an event, there is a drug, so it's an adverse event. And finally, very important business expectations. So the system needs to provide very low fault tolerance, so very low false negative rate. Imagine also classifying cancer, for example. You don't want to miss out on the positive example. So you're willing to trade off some of the false positives for review to reduce the false negative rate. The definitions of adverse events are also updating over time, so the system needs to be able to handle those. And finally, the goal was to achieve GXP compliance. And to our best knowledge, this is one of the first, among the first ones, productionized systems using AI for this purpose, but only in combination with a human review factor, so not purely relying on the machine. And now with that, going back a bit to the definition, we had adverse events in the beginning, but it's important to say that we are trying to detect potential adverse events. So not explicitly adverse events, but candidates for being an adverse event, because they need to be submitted for further review by safety experts. Those definitions are also maintained or defined by safety experts, not by people working on the project, so not by data scientists. It's very context and interpretation dependent, So even though the business rules are somewhat clear, if you give the same example to multiple people, they might classify it differently, right? Therefore, we implemented some inter-annotator agreements and so on to kind of fight against this. And finally, understanding what the adverse events, as I said, as well as language in general, human language, differs between people and also evolves over time. With that, to talk a bit more about the methodology we applied, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Moritz. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Damir. So I'll give you a brief rundown into the technical implementation. So roughly, AE detection, as Damir just explained it, detecting these potential candidates of adverse events, is a simple binary text classification problem, nothing too special there. You get an input text, you can split that into sentences, and for the sentences you can have some machine learning model, some text classifier that will predict a probability of that being an adverse event or being some other kind of text. Simple enough until here. The idea then would be we take the things that we believe to be adverse events, including also the things that we aren't sure they could still be adverse events, the probabilities might not be conclusive, and forward them to the human reviewer. So that would bring this human in the loop model that Damir just mentioned. Sounds simple until you think about the challenges that are also included in this problem. One is highly unbalanced classes. Damir just mentioned we have a lot more text that is not adverse events versus the text that is, and any machine learning practitioner knows having unbalanced classes is never good news. Another problem is that even between experts, there's a relatively low agreement as to what to assign to a specific tweet. The way we addressed that in our labeling was to have inter-annotator agreement and only include data when multiple annotators actually agree on the classification, because otherwise you can get very distracting data for the machine learning model. And then finally, the context to certain queries that we get can be inherently implicit. So it can be that the channel that things are posted to matters. It can be that some outer circumstances matter, and all of that can induce some context that we might not explicitly see. So I have a headache, simple statement with no medication involved anywhere, could be a potential adverse event if the context would actually imply the medication to be there. So it's good to err on the side of classifying more things as adverse events. So with this, I'm going to introduce the model that we're relying on. And of course, you all know it, BERT. Oops, that's the wrong BERT. That's the right BERT. So machine learning model for NLP. It's a general purpose language understanding model. The idea there is that they pre-trained this on a large amount of general text. It's written here, the numbers, so mostly the books corpus and Wikipedia in English. And there's a special version of BERT, which is called BioBERT, which has been pre-trained on a large amount of biomedical text, which for our purposes also has use, which I will get into more detail later. One thing that's interesting about BERT is that it's a bidirectional transformer model. I will not get into the depth of depth, and if somebody is interested, we can definitely chat about this in the lunch break. But the bidirectional transformer model, the idea is that context to a specific word, like here in this case bank, can actually happen on either side of the word, and that helps disambiguate some of the words, like bank in this case, which can either refer to a river bank or also to a bank where you actually store your money. And if we didn't have this bidirectional feature where we can capture context on either side, then in these cases it would be very difficult to make that distinction properly. And this is achieved through a process called masked training, where essentially the word bank would be masked out, so it wouldn't be visible during training, and the model would try to predict and fill that gap. There's some tricks you have to do to get this to actually work in practice. Again, I will have to defer them, otherwise it won't fit in the presentation. And one other task that BERT has been pre-trained to do is next sentence prediction, which roughly is a simple task. You take two sentences from a text, A and B, and you try to figure out if sentence B is actually the next sentence after A in the text or whether it's just some random sentence. And what this allows us to do is do some sort of higher level reasoning between different sentences, which is also something we will need for adverse event detection, because like I said, the context often is what actually gives things away, and that can happen in different sentences. Now, of course, if you want to train these models, you have to set some hyperparameters. I tried to kind of distill the learnings we had with training these into this simple table here. So I will not get too deeply into batch size and learning rate and training epochs, but I will focus on the maximum sequence length because we found that that matters quite a bit. And it's surprisingly large if you think about just Twitter, which is just 140 characters. But we have to handle other sides of text as well. It's not restricted to just this specific social media channel that is so present on everyone's mind. But it's actually, we have to deal also with other text, which can be longer. And if you set this parameter to too low of a value, then you start losing information about the rest of the text, which actually can impact your performance quite a bit. So one recommendation there would be set it as high as you can get it, which in our case is 512 characters. If we train these models, then we see these kind of training curves. So that gives us some confidence that the models are learning. This is averaged over 10 runs as the median log loss. And as we can see, they kind of converge similarly. This doesn't tell you too much about the actual performance, but it gives us confidence that training much longer doesn't make any sense in this case. This table, however, is much more conclusive as to the actual performance of the models. This is on held out test data, so the model has not seen this data during training. And as we can see, we can get relatively good numbers, in particular on accuracy, which is maybe the main metric people like to use, but let's keep in mind that this has highly unbalanced classes. So the accuracy alone is maybe not a good metric to use, because even just predicting other for every text will give you decent accuracy. What is a much more interesting and much more meaningful metric here is the recall, which teaches us something about how many of the adverse events we are actually capturing, which in our case makes me quite happy. It's about 98% for a single bird alone. And BioBird is slightly worse at 95%, so that could raise the question, okay, why have it in there at all? But actually there is some meaning to having BioBird because it allows us to capture certain edge cases in the text, and keep in mind missing adverse events is what we really want to avoid. And this allows us to capture some of those cases much better because there is also some biomedical lingo in some of these social media channels. And so BioBird understands that naturally. So if we even can capture just a few more cases by having it in here, it's definitely worth the effort. Yeah, but of course these models, we're not just using them directly. We have a productionalization pipeline around them. And one part of that is to use an ensemble of these text classifiers, which allows us to stack multiple bird and BioBird models together. We train them with different random seeds, producing different versions of these models. And then if any of those component models of an ensemble actually predicts anything to be an adverse event, we will actually flag it for review. This increases the false positives somewhat, so you will flag a few more things, but it is definitely worth the decrease in false negatives, which we found to be quite significant. And this actually gives you a very robust machine learning component to this. For certain specific edge cases, we also have a rule engine that allows us to introduce certain fixed rules that are not machine learning based to capture certain salient cases that we might notice as the system does its job in life. And here you can easily see the human in the loop model, where certain parts of the text actually get forwarded to the old manual review process, while certain parts actually fall into this other box and we can then safely discard them. Now, yesterday there was another talk on health trends in social media. And one point the presenter then made is you have to account for model drift in social media. A model that works well, as the numbers have shown before, now can be completely out of sync a few months down the line. So you have to account for that. And one thing that allows you to account for that is having retraining, so continuously retraining on new unseen data. And the fact that we have this human in the loop makes it relatively easy for us to do. One thing is we get access to the wrongly classified records that the human review process has already seen. So we can simply forward those for this retraining process. But this would never allow us to actually capture cases where the model has predicted other for a text and it was actually wrong, because those are discarded. So in certain intervals, we are subsampling some of these others to find cases where we falsely predicted other, and then also feed them back into this review process. With this, I come to the main conclusion of the talk. So monitoring social media channels in general is relatively challenging. There's a high volume of data that you have to account for. There's a complex vocabulary that you have to account for, acronyms, slangs, emojis, all of these things. Until now, most pharma companies are employing a highly manual, expensive, and time-consuming process for this. And the idea that we're proposing here is to reduce the workload that this process actually has to capture using NLP methods. And the method that we've shown here is fully productionalized. Unfortunately, the time didn't really allow me to go into the depth there, but I would absolutely love to share that in discussions. And it's GXP compliant, which we believe we are among the first to actually have achieved this. And there's been a cross-industry effort where we try to pour in other interested parties and see if we can foster some collaboration around this topic. So definitely also happy to talk about that. Some of the ongoing work that we're currently doing is incorporating additional channels, because social media is nice, but it's not the only channel where we have this reporting legislation in place. So we're also looking at emails, literature, websites, interactions with HCPs, and many more. Finally, we're also, and this came also up in the other social media talk yesterday, so there seems to also be some overlap between people doing social media analysis. We're also introducing support for multiple languages instead of just English, and we're extending the ensemble with new recent models like XLNet or ULM-Fit. And with this, I'd like to thank you, point out that this is just our opinion and not the opinion of the entire company, and open myself up to questions from you. Thanks.
So how did you handle the imbalanced class? Did you sample the negative ones, or do you do some weak supervision? Or?
So we actually, partially we were able to handle this through the inter-annotator agreements. So by having more people review adverse events, we kind of subsampled the data in that space a little bit. You have to be cautious that you still retain performance on other classes. So in the test set, we still have the same class distribution as originally. Yeah.
Yeah, so two questions. First, do you know what the recall rate is, including after your data goes through your rule engine?
We're currently still measuring this out on unseen new data. We mostly studied the machine learning models in isolation to check their performance, but yeah.
And secondly, what are your false positive rates?
I don't know if I've included it here. Unfortunately not. I will get back to you on that. I don't have it here.